just hit go live right now. I'll just hit go live. Ladies and gentlemen, can we please be seated?
World know about Nasser. Assalamu alaikum.
Good evening and welcome to In Their Own Words, Recollections of Former Political Prisoners in Palestine and South Africa. Since 1967, more than 800,000 Palestinians have been imprisoned. This means that 1 in 5 Palestinians have seen the inside of an Israeli prison cell, and even children can end up spending months in a military prison simply for demonstrating against the occupation in their own village. Today, there are about 4,650 Palestinians still in Israeli prisons, including 200 children and 40 women, as well as more than 500 administrative detainees who were arrested without charge or even trial. My name is Seadimo Tlala, and with me to discuss the depths to which Israeli prisons have invaded the very fabric of Palestinian society are comrades Abu al Hommus, Meyyassar Attiyyati, Neta Golan, Zubeida Jaffer, Prema Naidoo, and Horst Kleinschmidt, as well as other former political prisoners in Palestine and South Africa. This is a hybrid and in-person event, so some comrades will be joining remotely and some will be here in person. Welcome, comrades. Tonight, we will be discussing the complexities surrounding the issue of Palestinian political prisoners, the personal experiences of the respective comrades, as well as the ways in which all of us in today's audience can be more than just hashtag activists in the fight to free all political prisoners in Palestine and beyond. Before I bring my guests into the conversation, I would like to give some context to try to just emphasize just how bleak the situation of Palestine political prisoners in Israel is. Now, the condition of incarcerated Palestinians in Israel is considered amongst the worst in the Western world. Political prisoners are imprisoned in maximum security wings, which means they are mostly held in solitary confinement cells, where their ability to move between cells or in the yard is extremely limited. Incarcerated persons are exposed to extreme heat or cold, depending on the season, and live in a cage that is approximately the size of a single parking spot. The situation of these so-called security prisoners is worse than that of most criminal prisoners. They have no access to public telephones, except for a limited pilot that began in 2019. Visits by relatives are coordinated through the Red Cross and take place only once a month, but are limited to relatives of a first degree who must obtain both a permit to enter Israel as well as a permit to enter the prison, both of which can be rejected by the Shin Bet without any explanation. Now, while the Israel officials define these Palestinians as security prisoners and terrorists, the reasons for their incarceration are, in fact, mostly arbitrary. In fact, the incarceration regime appears to be targeted mostly at punishing any Palestinian who has dared to fight or struggle against occupation in various ways, making no distinction between a man who takes up arms or a child who attends a protest. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the restrictions imposed on Palestinian political prisoners have been even further tightened. Visits by relatives and lawyers have been completely cancelled, and because prisoners do not have access to telephones, they have been effectively cut off from the world. Even after some of these restrictions have been lifted for criminal prisoners, they have continued to apply for political Palestinian prisoners for a very long time. Now, Comrade Raid is the head of the International Relations Unit in the Commission of Detainees and Ex-Detainees. He is joining us remotely. Comrade Raid, welcome. Now, I am sure I have not done justice to paint the picture of just how bleak the situation of Palestine political prisoners in Israel is, and I was hoping that perhaps you could unpack the current situation with regards to Palestine political prisoners, as well as some current efforts to resist apartheid behind prisons in Israel. Yes, I can hear you. Yes, I can. I'm sure that our technical support will enhance your sound, but I think I apologize for that. As I've said, Comrade Raid is joining us remotely, and we are experiencing a little bit of technical difficulties. I'll take an indication from technical whether to come back to Comrade Raid or whether we should wait.
So while Comrade Raid is coming on, I thought I'll just share with you guys that Comrade Raid is trying to connect us with a prisoner who's actually in the prison in the Israel jail for the past 21 years. So if he gets it right in the next minute, you are going to listen to somebody from inside who is in for life in prison. So he will talk to us in Arabic, but I think just the fact that he's able to come and communicate with South Africa is quite a big thing for him. It's a security issue for him as well, so he's taking a big risk to talk to you. So let us hear if he's able to come on.
And of course, the identity of said prisoner cannot be revealed for his protection. I can hear you. I'm not sure. I'll get an indication from technical if we can proceed.
Yes, we have one of the Fatah leaders in the prisons. He would like to give a speech, and he's online now.
Thank you for that.
ابدأ. السلام عليكم. الاسم أسير فلسطين. بالنسبة لسجاني أحمل رقم فلا معنى للأسماء لدي. العمر 37 عام الآن. تاريخ اعتقالي كان في 6/6/2002. الحكم لقد حكم علي مدى الحياة رغم أنني سجنت وكان عمري في ذلك الوقت 17 عاما ونصف، أي أنني لم أبلغ السن القانوني بالنسبة للقوانين الدولية السارية في كل الدول، ومع ذلك تم الحكم علي مدى الحياة، والآن أنا أمكث في السجن منذ 20 عام. تحية محبة ووفاء إلى إخواننا الأعزاء شعب جنوب أفريقيا الأحبة. سلاما لكم وأنتم تقفون إلى جانب العدالة والحرية، وأنتم تقفون إلى جانب الضحية وإلى جانب الحق. ألف تحية وسلام إلى الشعب الشجاع والبطل شعب جنوب أفريقيا. في قلب كل شتاء ربيع ناضج، ووراء كل ليل فجر باسم. كان ليل جنوب افريقيا على الافارقه السود طويلا ومؤلما وحالكا، حيث عاشت الاغلبيه السوداء والملونه سناير الاستعمار الاستيطاني العنصري، حيث أغمض البيض أعينهم عن الواقع حتى يقنعوا أنفسهم بأن السود غير موجودين، وإن وجدوا فلا حقوق لهم. واستمرت العنصرية البيضاء ردحا طويلا من الزمن، مغلفة ببعد عرقي، ادعت نفسها حصرا كل الحقوق، ورفعت شعار الشعب المختار. لقد قررت حكومة البيض العنصرية على السود أن يعيشوا في سجون محكمة الإخفاء، أطلق عليها باندوستانات، كانت عبارة عن أماكن مهمشة خالية من الحقوق والإنماء. وكان كل ما يعني حكومة البيض هو الطاقات البشرية الرخيصة لخدمتها، وكان شعارها اعمل من أجل تسديدا للاستغلال والاستعباد للإنسان. لقد حرم الإنسان الأسود في ظل حكومة البيض العنصرية الكريهة من حقه في تملك الأرض أو حقه في السكن في وطنه أينما شاء، حيث سلك البيض وهم الأقلية في ذلك الوقت 87% من الأرض. وحرم الأسود أيضا من حقه بالتصويت وتقرير مستقبله ومصيره، ولم يكن يتمتع بأي من عائدات الدولة صاحبة أغنى مناجم الذهب والألماس في العالم. وقمعت حكومة البيض آنذاك في كل مرة نضال السود الهادف إلى تصحيح هذا المسار الشاذ والظالم والعنصري. لم تكن موازين القوى لصالح السود، فكان البيض يملكون السلطة والسلاح النووي والثروة والأرض، بينما لم يملك السود إخوتنا إلا الحق والإصرار والعزيمة والأمل بالغد المشرق. كان يحركهم العشق والشغف بالحرية والعدالة، لذلك خطوا مسيرتهم الزاخرة بالمآسي والآمال والنضال. كان روادها أكثر من جيل، وضحى من خلالها الآلاف بأنفسهم لكي يبلغ درب الحرية وتتجسد العدالة وتزهق العنصرية اللعينة. علينا أن لا نقف أيها الإخوة عند التاريخ طويلا إلا إذا تعلق الأمر بالاستفادة من دروسه وتكريم وتخليد أبطاله. إن شعبينا عاشا الألم الكبير وفرض عليهما العنصرية ذاتها، حيث تشابهت إسرائيل الصهيونية مع الأسس التاريخية والمضمون الإيديولوجي بحكومة البيض العنصرية التي كانت سائدة في جنوب إفريقيا من حيث فكرة الاستعمار الاستيطاني. ويمثل هذا النوع من الاستعمار في مضمونه أقصى أشكال العنصرية. كلا الكيانين يتشابهان بالأسس وبالمنطلقات التفوق العرقي وسياسات الفصل الجغرافية بين الأجناس. وما يتعرض له الشعب الفلسطيني اليوم والأرض الفلسطينية ما هما إلا أمثلة صارخة من حيث وجه الشبه للاستعمار العنصري الذي عاشهما شعب جنوب أفريقيا الشقيق. وبالنظر إلى الواقع الفلسطيني ستشاهدون حجم العنصرية والفصل والاستيلاء على الأرض والممتلكات لصالح المستوطنين الذين قدموا من كل أنحاء العالم على الأرض الفلسطينية. هناك أيها الإخوة بسط عنصري في المنطقة وفي السكن وفي الشارع وفي المياه وفي كل شيء لصالح المستوطن اليهودي الراديكالي على حساب الأرض الفلسطينية والمواطن الفلسطيني. ومع ذلك إننا الآن نستلهم الدروس والعبر من صلابة وإصرار الشعب الجنوب إفريقي في مواجهة الظلم والاستبداد والعنصرية. ويظهر جليا في ذاكرتنا رمز السود ونضالاتهم مانديلا نلتم مانديلا، كما نذكر ميثاق الحرية الذي اعتمدتموه عام 1955 وشكلت هذه الوثيقة التسوية هاديا للنضال السود. نخاطبكم اليوم كأسرى فلسطينيين ونبرك لكم التحية من داخل زنازيننا العنصرية. نخاطبكم ونحن على أعتاب الدخول في معركة الأمعاء الخاوية والتي تأتي بعد أن نفذ صبرنا عن تحمل العقوبات الجماعية التي تمارسها دولة الأبرتايد الإسرائيلية، حيث تفرض علينا العقوبات في أبسط حقوقنا، حيث في ساحات الدفء وتحجب عنا نصيبنا من دفء حرارة الشمس وأشعتها الحنونة والتي تذكرنا بأمهاتنا، وتصادر حقنا في التواصل مع عائلاتنا عبر الاتصال الحسي، حيث نرى عائلاتنا من خلف الزجاج في زيارة لمدة 45 دقيقة ومرة كل شهر. وأيضا تمنعنا من الاتصال بهم، وربما هي الدولة الوحيدة في هذا العالم التي تحجب شبكات الاتصال عن الأسرى وذويهم. إنهم يا إخوتنا يصنفون المواد الغذائية معايير أمنية، حيث يمنع على الأسرى الفلسطينيين العديد من أصناف الخضار والفاكهة والأسماك، وتفرض علينا مؤسسة التعسف المدعوة مصلحة السجون إجراءات قمعية ممنهجة تطال استقرار وراحة الأسير حتى داخل زنزانته بالتنقل القسري والتفتيشات الليلية والاعتداء على راحة الأسير حتى في نومه بمرافقة الكلاب البوليسية.
Comrade Raid, are you still with us?
Yes,
Thank you for sharing
he got
that.
disconnected.
Yes, I figured. So
He got
thank you so much for connecting us with said prisoner whose identity we can't reveal. Could you please unpack a little bit of what has been said in that encounter for us?
He's a Palestinian prisoner. He's sentenced for lifetime, and he's one of the leaders of the hunger strike that is planned to be on the 25th. During this month, it was a hard situation inside the Israeli prisons, and the Palestinian prisoners are planning for going to a hunger strike on the 25th. Negotiations since a week, it's going on, up and down. Yesterday, there was a very important meeting with the Palestinian Authority, with the Israeli Authority, and they negotiated about the situation of the prisoners. We got positive energy, and they want to cool it down in the prisons. So I think that maybe tomorrow afternoon or tomorrow in the morning we can hear good news. Palestinian prisoners don't seek or it's not a goal for them to go into a hunger strike, but they use this weapon when the negotiation fails, and when they see that there's no way other than going into hunger strike to get their demands. I would like to give a brief, small paper about the Israeli violations against the Palestinian political prisoners inside the Israeli occupation prisons and their current conditions. In 2021, the occupying power Israel continued its repressive policy of arbitrary detention while systematically violating Palestinian political prisoners' fundamental rights enshrined in international humanitarian law and international conventions and norms. May 2021 marked a milestone on arbitrary detention given the intense rate of arrests and violations against detainees, mainly in occupied Jerusalem. In early September 2021, following the escape of 6 Palestinian political prisoners from Galboa prison, the occupying power organized and escalated widespread arrests that amount to crimes against humanity. According to our documented statistics, Israel, the detaining power, daily arrests 10 to 15 Palestinians, including children and women. Attacks and torture usually accompany the detention process from the first moment of detention. Such a policy of mass confinement targets the entire community and affects almost all segments and aspects of Palestinian life. It goes further than detention and destroys the Palestinian fabric, social, economic, psychological, and development structures. From the beginning of 2021, the occupying power OP Israel detained 7,157 Palestinians, including 1,149 children and 154 women, in addition to issuing more than 1,096 administrative detention orders. The occupying power continues to arrest and detains 4,650 Palestinians, including 34 female prisoners, 160 children and minors, 500 administrative detainees, 9 parliamentarians, and 550 ill prisoners who urgently need treatment and health care, with more than 10 of them suffering from cancer. Israel sentenced 544 prisoners to life sentence, including Abdullah al-Barghouthi, serving the highest term of 67 life sentences. Since 1967, the occupying power has been responsible for the death of 227 Palestinian detainees in its prisons, including 71 prisoners who died from deliberate medical negligence, in brackets, slow killing. The policy of medical negligence was the most prominent reason behind the death of the prisoners in the last few years. The occupying power continues hold the bodies of 8 prisoners martyred inside prisons: Anis Dole, Aziz Wisat, Faris Baroud, Nassar Taqatka, Bassam Sayeh, Saad al-Gharabli, Kamal Abu Wa'ar, and Mahmoud Sami. The occupying power still incarcerates 25 pre-Oslo prisoners detained before the signing of the Oslo Agreement, the oldest of whom are Karim Yunus and Maher Yunus, that have been arrested since January 1983, and Nael al-Barghouthi, who served the longest period in detention, a total of 41 years. Al-Barghouthi was released in the prisoner exchange deal with Israel in 2011 and was re-arrested in 2014. The occupying power detention of Palestinians is a tool to consolidate its colonial regime, including its illegal policies of transferring prisoners from prisons to prisons inside Israel, administrative detention, torture, and degrading inhuman treatment, children detention and house arrest, extrajudicial killings, medical negligence, unfair trials, and collective punishment, among others. Following the escape of 6 Palestinian political prisoners from Galbour prison on 6th of September, the Israeli prison service, with full support from the Israeli political and security establishment, launched an organized attack on Palestinian prisoners using the Matsada repressive unit. Which is well equipped and weaponed and having police dogs. It's like a gang, and you have to be arrested. Even if you are arrested, you have to be one more time arrested, moving you from one division to another, or from one prison to another. They will take you late at night. The Israeli prison service carries out extensive storming and assaulting operations in many prisons, especially the Negev, Rimon, Ofer, and Galbour. And this is why now we are talking about a hunger strike, because of this acts after the escape of the Palestinians from Galbour prison. The IPS also closes down prisons, section, conducts solidarity, confinement, and collective isolation operations. I think this is how things going on in the Israeli prisons. I believe that tomorrow it's a very important day. This is why I can't travel to South Africa to join you. Thank you for this meeting, and for us as a Commission of Prisoners and Commission of Detainees and ex-detainees, we love to always keep you posted about the situation of the Palestinian prisoners inside the Israeli occupied prisons. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Comrade Raid. That was Comrade Raid joining us remotely. He is the head of the International Relations Unit in the Commission of Detainees and Ex-Detainees. Thank you so much for availing yourself, and we are very honored that you could share that very moving account with us. I think the most important thing from what you were saying, and like my important takeaway, is that, you know, these prisoners are not just passive subjects that are simply waiting for their release. And in fact, over the years, out of the various attempts and pushbacks, I think that the biggest political resistance has actually happened within the prison walls themselves. In fact, hunger strikes since the occupation began in 1967 have been some of the most effective ways in which the Israeli policies have been shaped and in order to improve the conditions of prisoners. In fact, in the 1960s and 70s, as I recall, hunger strikes were used to end the slave labor that was imposed on Palestinian political prisoners. And in 2012, it is the hunger strikes that effectively ended the solitary confinement of many political prisoners, although they were only transferred into general population. So I have a lot of confidence and faith in the upcoming hunger strike, and it is my hope that we'll get more into efforts that some of us can do in the audience in order to support some of these efforts. Now, in addition to every single horrendous thing we have heard so far, what is worse is that Palestinian political prisoners who have completed their sentence may face administrative detention. Now, this is a tool that is used loosely by the Israeli authorities in the occupied territories. Under this form of detention, prisoners can, upon release, be re-jailed immediately and indefinitely. Administrative detention orders are reviewed every 6 months, but the detainees are never told what the crimes they are accused of are, nor shown the evidence against them. As a result, it is virtually impossible to defend themselves against administrative detention. To unpack this a little bit more is Comrade Neta. Comrade Neta is an Israeli anti-apartheid activist. She co-founded the International Solidarity Movement, Return Solidarity, Jews Against Genocide, and Israelis Against Apartheid. She's also an active member of Boycott From Within. Currently, she lives in Nablus with her Palestinian partner, their daughters, and their cat, which is an act that is considered illegal under Israeli law. Comrade Neta, welcome.
Inviting me. It's a real honor. I'll turn on my video. It's an honor to be here with you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I feel like part of what I can bring to this timely and important discussion is also the perspective of an Israeli activist that can really kind of give that perspective of the difference between how Israelis are treated in the legal system and how Palestinians are treated. Because, I mean, how the situation for Palestinian prisoners, we've heard a lot and we will hear, but I think it's really important I don't even know if people know that, we have separate prisons, Palestinians are in separate prisons often, separate, the ones from the occupied territories, separate courts, separate laws, right? Palestinians are ruled by military law. Well, if I'm arrested, if me and a Palestinian are both arrested in a demonstration in the occupied territories, and if we both get taken to the police station, different laws apply to me and different laws apply to that person until they will be taken actually by the military, probably to face like a military court and a military judge. So as an Israeli, I can't be held for more than 24 hours unless I'm dangerous or, there's flight risk. I have to be taken in front of a judge, and only within I have rights. I have a lot of rights within the Israeli legal system. And for Palestinians, it's exactly the opposite. The same Palestinian that will be arrested with me at a demonstration has no chance of going home the same day. While I have almost no chance of staying, a Palestinian will only have to be taken in front of a judge within 8 days, and will be, they're considered a security risk straight away just because they're Palestinian. So that, most of you are very, know a lot about what's happening, but I think if there are people who don't, it's just really important to understand that the Palestinians are going to be taken in front of a judge where there's like a Jewish Israeli military judge in uniform. The prosecutor is also a Jewish Israeli military person. The laws are laws basically orders by the military commander, and they are the enemy within this system, which is completely different. So the whole system is a system in which they're guilty by nature of their being Palestinian, while I'm taken to a completely different system, to a civil system, different laws that are basically created to serve me, especially particularly as an Ashkenazi Jew, as a Jew coming from European descent. Like there's racism also within the Israeli system, within the Israeli civil system, the kind of racism that African Americans, for example, experience in the United States, where it's not a difference in the law, but it's a difference in how the law is applied. But that whole system, the laws in that system, give people rights, while the law in the military system treat every prisoner as immediately they are a threat. They're a threat because they're Palestinian. And the military, legal system or justice system, the justice definitely needs to have, to be between exclamation marks, between quotation marks, because has nothing to do with justice. It's clearly just part of the military system that is designed to keep Palestinians suppressed. And in order to keep people suppressed, they have to be terrorized. And one of the most effective tools to terrorize, the population into, to try to terrorize the Palestinian population into submission, which Israel has failed to do, despite being like a nuclear power with so much funding and so much, they have failed until now to bring the Palestinian people to their knees, but they're trying. Yes. And I feel that recently we're seeing, more brutality, more cruelty. And I think that that's kind of, from what I've heard, is very much like a sign towards the end of any, oppressive regime, that at the end they really kind of lose a lot of their humanity. And I believe that we're seeing that now. So I'll just add that right now, the administrative detention is one of these tools that already that Raed mentioned. I don't know if that Raed mentioned administrative. Yeah. Okay. Administrative detention is one of these very important tools in terms of suppression of the Palestinian population, because like, as you mentioned, anyone can be taken at any time without having to give a reason. And so everyone knows that they are, a possible target. And right now, while it's true that hunger strikes have been a very effective tool, recently, Israel has been more like waiting longer. I mean, they've always kind of waited until the prisoner is like on their deathbed to make an agreement. But now they're really bringing people to the very edge. It's taking longer and longer. And that was one tool that administrative detainees, which means people who were taken without being given any reason and without knowing when they will be released. The tool of hunger strike is now, it's still available and they are planning to do it, but it's really, it's becoming very hard because the Israeli public is becoming more and more kind of hard-hearted and not, even when people are already clearly, obviously not a threat, because administrative detention is supposed to be, keeping someone in detention because they're a threat. So you're talking about people who are, on their deathbeds and still, they really have to be on the brink to be released. So right now, since the beginning of January, since the 1st of January, administrative detainees have started a strike in which they are refusing to show up to their hearings. So in these hearings, the hearings are kind of a farce because, it's only secret evidence that the judge and, sometimes there's a Secret Service man at the hearing. So these hearings, it doesn't happen that the judge decides, not to keep someone in administrative detention, but sometimes it happens that they will shorten the detention, and the detainees have decided not to show up to their hearings, in order to protest this farce, and they're like giving up one way to possibly shorten their detention. So one of the things that I had a court case coming up for activism related to the siege of Gaza, protesting against the siege of Gaza. And, my court case is, compared to what Palestinians face, it's really a joke, kind of something very minor. It wouldn't cause me any damage. I wouldn't, but it was an opportunity to say that in solidarity with the administrative detainees who are striking and not going to their sessions, I also boycotted. I'm also boycotting the Israeli courts and didn't go to the hearing, and so an arrest warrant was issued against me, and I'm working now to widen, to get more Israelis. I mean, we're to join this boycott of the Israeli court system in solidarity with the administrative detainees. And we are particularly focusing on the case of one Palestinian child who is the only child in administrative detention. Just one second, Nizar Mishala. Who's the only child. He was arrested. He's unfortunately no longer a child because he was arrested when he was 16. And he has now turned 18 in the prison. His name is Amal Nahle. And he is one of the 6 prisoners that Raed mentioned. So his next date for the administrative detention, it's like reviewed every now and again. So his date will be on the 17th of May. And we are hoping that if we can raise attention, we know that like apartheid policies, they basically, as you know as well, they thrive in the dark. When you bring, a lot of attention and light to them, they have to morph somehow. And so we want to bring attention to his case and hope that he can go home on the 17th of May. And obviously attention to all the administrative detainees. I'll just add that one of the detainees has already gone into hunger strike. One of the administrative detainees has been striking since the 2nd of May. His name is Halil Al-Awade, and he's 40 years old, from Edna, which is west of Hebron. And so he's already been, he's in Ofer military prison, and he's already been striking for 21 days. So it's a very, very important time. I really just want to thank you all for being here today so that we can find ways, as you say, to bring attention and work towards the freedom of all political prisoners.
Thank you so much for
Thank
that,
you.
Comrade Neta. And thank you so much for, I can't imagine how painful this account, just sharing your experiences and your relative privilege in this situation must be, because, from what I'm hearing you say, it's almost as though being Palestinian is the crime in and of itself. And just by virtue of being Palestinian, you can be incarcerated indefinitely, and this administrative detention is one tool that is used to achieve this mandate. And it is particularly saddening and shocking to hear about children being held in such conditions. And I do hope, as this conversation unfolds, we can get into some of the more tangible ways of how we as the audience can take part in bringing more light to the situation, because as you were saying, the more light that is being brought onto the situation, the more likely it is that it will just crumble, because it only thrives in darkness. And it is impossible to actually hear about some of these accounts and not think about our own recent history here in South Africa. In the 1960s as well, here in South Africa, prisons and police were a major weapon against political dissent during South Africa's apartheid, and various detention without trial laws were introduced through the General Law Amendment Act, and any opposition to apartheid, similarly to what I'm hearing about what is happening with the Palestine political prisoners, including children, could be arrested without a warrant. And it is important to note that even during apartheid, even though courts spoke out, even though there was an uprising and resistance, the holdings of the court were difficult to implement because the apartheid government was not under any obligation to enforce them. And in fact, South Africa was under parliamentary sovereignty, which meant that no rule that Parliament could pass could be overturned by even the courts. And during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings, former political prisoners have reported that under apartheid, similarly like what we're hearing with the Palestine political prisoners, persons incarcerated for murder and other crimes could actually receive more privileges than political prisoners. And in fact, when political prisoners were treated so incredibly cruelly and their spirits could not be broken, then the apartheid government resorted to mental and psychological torture, and that is how the use of solitary confinement was implemented to bring about psychological breakdown and as a form of punishment. Now, Comrade Zubeida, who was an award-winning South African journalist, author, and activist, and started her career at the Cape Town Times in the 1980s, can tell us a little bit more about just connecting the dots between South Africa and what's happening currently with Palestinian prisoners, especially what lessons we have learned here at home that can be implemented in this situation. Now, Comrade Zubeida has also spent a short stint at the Rand Daily Mail in Johannesburg in the same year. Her work has earned her numerous local and international awards, which have included the Muslim Views Achiever Award, as well as the Honor Medal for Distinguished Service to Journalism from the University of Missouri in the USA. And in 2020, she received the Alan Kirkland Surga Lifetime Achievement Award for her country's media industry. Comrade, welcome.
Thank you.
I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about, just your experiences as an activist during apartheid South Africa and how it's shaped your life today. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure. I am very touched listening to these testimonies because it's so painful. So painful, and it takes us back to the time when we were in the middle of that situation. And pain is universal. Pain is universal, but pain is also very particular. It's different for each person. Listening to those stories, the prisoner that's there already for 21 years, and the stories we heard, you realize that for each one, it's going to be, or for each one, it's not an easy journey, and it's a journey that they, sadly, even though we're together as a collective, in the end, it's a very kind of personal, an individual, and to some extent, a lonely journey. Now, I speak from experience of, experience in my life that started, something that happened 42 years ago, and Firoza's asked that I share my personal experience. I'm usually very reluctant to do that because, as I said to her, that even though so many years have passed, it just never leaves one. So I can understand what people are going through, that it must be so horrendous because it distorts one's life. In 1980, I was a young journalist at the Cape Times, and my professional careers just coincided with the uprising in the Western Cape and in South Africa. And so I was running around and I was covering all these events, you know, bombs going off and marches and protests and students protests. And I eventually, 6 months into that year, was asked by my editor to write a story or to find out who the police had killed and the army had killed. And they had killed, we understood that there was over 40 people killed in the neighborhoods around where I lived and beyond. And the police wouldn't release the details, the information. And so I, quite oblivious and not fully, being too young to understand, you know, the enormity of this. I was 22 years old. I was just very fascinated to be able to run around and I had to go from shack to shack, from house to house and ask, do you know anybody who was shot? Do you know anybody who was shot? And I even found somebody who'd been shot was still had the bullet in their back. And after 2 weeks, I wrote the story, having found 26 families. And it was published. And because I've got such a limited time here, I can't obviously go into all the details. But the long and short of it was, 2 weeks after the story was published, I was arrested, detained, and went through an experience that, and for those of you who are here who have been through these experiences, I could never be the same again. Because I was tortured, they had this idea that I was part of an ANC network, which I wasn't, and so whatever I said, they wanted names from me and they wanted information. And so I was eventually unconscious. I was eventually, in a very terrible condition, which I write about here in my book. And I then was eventually charged and acquitted eventually. So I never actually went to Spain. I was charged with possession of 3 banned books, including Wretched of the Earth. So it was a very strange time. And as Neta was saying that the laws applied differently to us than it applied to the common law prisoners and the criminals. It was very different. And I actually lived through that and saw that. And after that, I couldn't really recover. Because the security police used to follow me when I got off the train in the morning to go to work. They used to follow me and took away my passport. But I think I only understood many years later that it was on this assumption that I was part of a network.
Yes.
And at that stage, I wasn't. And so I couldn't make sense of it, but all these things were happening. And then eventually I got detained again. But then I sort of became involved in community newspapers. I became, you could say I became a full-time activist, left my job, my formal job. And then 5 years later got detained again. And again tortured. And this time I was pregnant with my daughter. And they threatened to give me a potion to kill the baby. And they, anyway, it's very difficult for me to talk about this, always been very difficult, but the long and short of it is, we came to 1985, 1986, and at that time in 1985, in fact, that's why I was detained with other people, because we were preparing for the release of Nelson Mandela. And we all were very hopeful. If you remember, Eminent Persons Group was here in the country. We were sort of preparing for his release was imminent. And then the next thing happened, that the South African authorities, the apartheid state, sent in planes into the neighboring countries and bombed the ANC bases there, and that was a clear signal for us that there was going to be no change. And they set about in the next 4 years detaining up to 30,000 people all around the country, smashing our internal movement, smashing the infrastructure. The offices of our community newspapers were burnt, the trade union offices were burnt, printing presses were smashed. I mean, it was, as Neta said, it was those kicks of the dying horse. And I'll never forget, an activist came up to me and was crying, and she said, this was about 86, and she said to me, they're never going to release our prisoners. And this is what I want my message to you, wherever, if you are listening to me on that side, they're never going to release our political prisoners. People are never going to come back from exile. We're never going to have a democratic election. And she was sobbing and crying. And I'm so thankful to God that I had the strength at that moment to say to her, listen, I can tell you without a doubt in my mind that they are going to release Nelson Mandela, the political prisoners are going to be released, that the people from exile are going to come home. The only problem is I cannot tell you when. So you have to pull yourself together now, and you have to, sit it out for the long haul. And, I think that was the one thing, even now with the challenges that we have in our country, that I try and remind myself all the time that we must keep focused. Keep focused, and we mustn't lose focus of where we want to be. And it takes, the biggest part of it is, as I said, pain is universal. Your experiences are not that, it's much more extreme than ours, definitely. I've been to Palestine, I've been to Israel a number of years ago, and I just told myself I'll never ever go back there again because it was too hard, it was too painful. And so the big thing is, I think in this situation, even in this situation, we have to be part and reach out and be together and do things together, but we also have to build our mental strength.
Yes.
Because if we don't do that, if we don't find methods, if we don't ask one another, how do you do this? How can I keep sane in this situation? Then you will lose hope. And we cannot afford to lose hope.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was an incredibly painful account, and I'm so grateful to you for just allowing yourself to go there emotionally for our benefit. But more than that, I'm extremely grateful for your effort and work over the years. And, as Comrade Neta was saying, you're one of the people that was shining light in the situation, and it is that effort of people like yourself that were shining light on what was happening here that ultimately contributed to that ending for us and paved the way for people like myself to be able to sit here and have never known or experienced any of the hardships that you've gone through. So I'm incredibly thankful for you, and my entire generation as well is grateful to you and people from your generation as well. And I cannot wait to read your book, and thank you that, we can learn from your life, we can learn from your experiences. And one of the things you spoke about was how on one of the instances you were detained for having illegal books, essentially. And it reminds me of the situation that's happening in the United States at the moment, where there is a ban on literature, books such as books that talk about some of the revolutions that have happened, books that talk about the Holocaust, books such as Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye have just been banned in the United States. And it seems like we've come so far, and yet we're still in the exact same place. But again, I'm eternally grateful to you, and that you still continue to shine your light and share your light with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, going back to what's happening with Palestinian prisoners, Comrade Meyyassar was a Palestinian female prisoner who has been arrested multiple times. In fact, I think it's up to 3 times. First, when she was only 17 in secondary school, and then again in 2009 with her brother, and a third time in 2013. As I understand it, she's been deported out of her country and banned from traveling to Palestine for 23 years. And over the years, she has volunteered for the International Solidarity Movement, worked as a cultural director for the General Palestinian Women's Union, and is now working for the Palestinian Embassy in Tunis. Comrade Meyyassar, welcome.
Good afternoon.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. Now, for many of us who are listening to this conversation, who have never set foot in a prison cell, let alone an Israeli prison, we cannot begin to imagine the brutal mental, physical, as well as health effects of perpetual incarceration, or even the impact that it has on families of incarcerated persons. Now, through reflecting on your own personal experiences, could you kindly please share some light with us on the impact that imprisonment has on Palestinian families? We're struggling a little bit with the connection. I'm not sure. Comrade Meyyassar, can you hear me? I think we'll come back to Comrade Meyyassar, and technical is just trying to get her back. So we'll move back to the South African context. Comrade Naidoo, who was a leading anti-apartheid organizer in the 1970s, is also part of this conversation. He was detained on 21 November 1981 under the Internal Security Act. And as I said earlier, there were a whole bunch of legislation that was enacted just to silence people and disappear any sort of dissidents. He was also subjected to beatings and torture, and after months in detention, he was tried and sentenced to an effective further year in prison on the charge of harboring an escaped convict and 2 other political prisoners. On his release, he took part in the formation of the United Democratic Front and was detained for 8 months during the state of emergency in 1985. After the first non-racial elections in 1994, which is the year in which I was born, Comrade Naidoo served in senior local authority positions in Johannesburg until his retirement just in 2016, and he is now presently aboard of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. Comrade Naidoo, welcome.
Oh. Thank you very much for that introduction.
Thank
I don't
you
really
so
deserve that
much.
kind of introduction.
No, thank you so much for availing yourself to be here.
Let me take this opportunity to thank the PSA, Feroza in particular, for giving me this opportunity to share my experiences. I want to start off by saying that it is quite shameful that the world is silent when there are atrocities committed in Yemen, in Palestine, where children are being killed, where hospitals are being bombed, and the world is silent. And I think this is an indictment on the world. The world, while we sympathize with the women and children that are dying in Ukraine, we are anti-war. We believe that war is evil wherever it is. But we cannot be one-sided in this war. Having said that, I want to start off by saying, free Palestine, free Palestine. Free Palestine. I want to talk to you about my own story, as indicated by our program director, that I was arrested in November 1981. I was arrested by security police, and you are totally in the hands of security police. I was taken to the then John Foster Square, which is now Johannesburg Police Station, taken to the 10th floor, and immediately I was handcuffed. I had my hands behind my back and handcuffed, and Major Conrad, those days, believe it or not, I did have some hair. Major Conrad grabbed me by my hair and banged my forehead on the table and told me that this building is called Timor Heights, and when they finished with it, they will call it Prema Heights, when they finished with me. I went through a difficult period. I was interrogated for 7 days and 7 nights continually, without sleep. I was then convicted. Myself and Comrade Shirish Nanabai were convicted for harboring an escaped political prisoner from Pretoria Central Prison by the name of Stephen Lee, and we were sentenced to 1 year. I think Firoza was in court the day I was sentenced. And I'm sure there were many others who are here today who were in court. Now, in my case, myself and Sharish weren't treated as political prisoners. We were taken to the Fort prison in Johannesburg, which is now the Constitutional Hill, which is right here. And we were put into a cell with common law prisoners. And that in itself was quite an horrific experience. What common law prisoners? Myself and Sharish were fortunate because what had happened in court, when I was sentenced and Sharish was sentenced, I gave the Amandla salute. And they pushed me down the stairs, and that made headlines in the paper. So when we got to the prison here at number 4, they used to call it those days, the prisoners already knew. And in a kind of way, they respected our defiance. So they didn't molest us. But believe me, life for common law prisoners was very difficult. It was even more difficult than it was for political prisoners. All kinds of horrific things used to happen. Anyhow, we served our sentence. We got, once a month, we got our visits. And while we were serving our sentence, they never allowed us to shower. So we had access to our lawyers, and we brought an interdict, just for a simple thing like allowing us to shower. Yes. And the interdict was granted, and we were allowed to shower. It was in winter, and we had to shower outside in the open, but we enjoyed it, because it was the first time in about 3 months we were getting water on our bodies, although it was freezing cold. On another occasion, they also never allowed us out of the cell. Only time we got out of our cell when we had to collect our meals. Then too, we complained to our lawyers, and again our lawyers interdicted. So then they allowed us out to do some cleaning work, which we enjoyed at the time under the circumstances. I was released after serving 1 year, and I became active in the Transvaal Indian Congress, in the United Democratic Front, and many of you who are sitting here will recall those days as activists. I mean, Dr. Saluji was there, Dr. Isub Jasat was the president of the Transvaal Indian Congress, and many others who are here. Kishta, also an ex-MK member, was active with us, and we worked. When the Matthew Ganiwe, Fort Kalata, and Sparrow Mkonto were arrested and murdered in the Eastern Cape, we decided to organize a bus from Lenasia to take us to Craddock. And the funeral itself was quite an experience. There were thousands of people. The ANC flag and the SACP flag was very prominent.
Yes.
On our way back from there, we were arrested and taken to Protea police station, and we were held. We were quite a lot of us from Lens. We were about 15 or 20. And when we were taken then to the New Sun City prison, we met with comrades from Soweto and the rest of the country. But there we were with other political prisoners. Lalu Chiba was there, Ismail Mamoniat was there, Rashid Sidat was there. So we could organize ourselves. We organized ourselves, we had political discussions. We didn't have much contact with the security police.
Yes.
And we were in a position where we challenged the prison authorities on the food that we got, on not getting enough exercises. And we won small concessions. They allowed, the food improved. We went on hunger strike on 2 occasions. First went on hunger strike for 3 days. And a little bit of an anecdote. When we were discussing the second hunger strike, we were discussing amongst ourselves, and the discussion was how long should we go for? And our comrade Isu Chiba said we should go for 30 days. And people like Ismail Mamona said, "Come, comrade Isu, we're not here to die." So we went on hunger strike for 10 days. And the food improved. We were allowed 1 or 2 visits, but the visit was supervised by the security police. We were brought from Sun City to Protea police station, and the visit we got was in front of us. And the security police were quite abusive, swearing, shouting, referring us as your wife brought some kulikos for you, those kinds of things, try to humiliate you, But as you know, that for political prisoners, in South Africa, black men, and when I say black, I mean colored Indian and African people, were taken to Robben Island. And I had a brother, Indris, who served 10 years on Robben Island. And in that 10 years, we visited him a few times. But the most horrific experience on that visit was the boat ride to Robben Island. My mother, who was already elderly at the time, had to go down the boat, had what do they call those holes at the bottom?
Yes, I see what
And
you
it had literally had a step ladder. And my mother was quite aged at the time, and she was forced to go down there.
Yes.
I remember that Comrade Sunny Singh's mother, who was also elderly, slipped and fell.
Oh, no.
And they actually laughed at her.
No.
And on the boat, they insult you. You get off the boat on Robben Island and you go to the waiting room and you get insulted and shouted at. And then you visit through a panel, glass panel. And then they tell you suddenly time's up, you must go.
Yes.
So this is the kind of thing. On Robben Island, obviously, in the early days, they had a lot of difficulties. They too went on hunger strike. As Madiba says in his book, he wasn't allowed to wear long pants. because African people were not allowed to long pants. Katrada was given bread, but Mandela wasn't given bread. And so there were many, many struggles that took place on Robben Island, from hunger strike to go slows, and they won. And obviously after serving many, many years, conditions did improve on Robben Island. I just want to talk to you a little bit about my sister Shanti, who was detained in 1962. And we didn't know where she was. We didn't see her. And then after about 6 months, we were told that she will be brought to court to give evidence against Winnie Mandela. And this was the first time that the family had seen Shanti. And she looked in a very bad state. She had lost a lot of weight. She was run down. And my mother, in seeing Shanti, tried to rush to her. And the police pushed her away. They didn't allow her to see her. When she was called to the court to give evidence against Winnie Mandela, she refused. The judge then called for an adjournment and asked the lawyer that he would, because he also he saw that she had a very difficult time, the torture in detention, and the judge then said, spoke to the lawyer and said, persuaded to give evidence, I don't want to sentence her. The lawyers called myself and my brother Murthy and asked for guidance. It wasn't an easy decision, but we told Shanti that we will support her whatever decision she takes. She took it, she went back to the court and told the judge she cannot give evidence. And she was then sentenced to about 2 months in prison. She was in detention, which meant she was in solitary confinement. When she was sentenced for 2 months, they didn't take her out of the cell. All they did was change the clothes to prison clothing. And when a sentence was up, they kept her in solitary confinement. So all in all, she was kept for almost 400 days in solitary confinement. And when you're in that situation, the only people you see is the security police. And they are abusive to you all the time. I just want to talk to the same team that interrogated me also interrogated Dr. Neil Agate. And all of you must be aware that Dr. Agate's killers, the judge ruled that he was murdered. And it was the same security police that interrogated me. And on the day that Dr. Agate was murdered, they allowed us visits. I was then, by that time, serving my detention at the Vereniging police station. So one morning they came, not saying a word to me. They put me into leg irons and chains, and they drove me to Johannesburg. Not saying what, and I didn't know what it going. I mean, you think the worst, and obviously you're nervous, and they took me to a room, a small little room, which was full of big security police guys, you know, these are rugby player types. Shouting and screaming, and then suddenly my wife walked in. I was still in chains, and they started insulting my wife, like you can't believe. And after about 2 or 3 minutes, they say, right, the visit is over. And they took me back. So I still didn't know, well, I got the visit, but I didn't know what was. So on the way back to Vereniging, I saw a placard, detainee found hanged in cell, something to that effect. And then you wonder now who this is. When I got to Vereniging, the black policeman who was there, was quite sympathetic. And he brought me the Citizen. And I saw the Citizen about Agate being killed. And you all know, I mean, if you've been, I gave evidence at both the inquest, the first inquest that took place, and the inquest that took place recently, that Agate was murdered, and the police that murdered him is Lieutenant Whitehead, Dirk Coetzee, Warrant Officer Smith, Dietrich is still alive, incidentally. They are alive, and I hope the National Prosecuting Authority looks for all those who are alive and charge them for murdering our comrade Dr. Agate.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that.
Yes, thank you so much. Now, due to technical difficulties, of course, we are very tight on time, but thank you so much for sharing those personal experiences. And just a little bit about myself. I mean, I'm working currently on my dissertation on the abolition of the Supermax prison, which is essentially solitary confinement, as a constitutional imperative in South Africa. And as I was listening to both of you just speak about how, you know, solitary confinement was used by the apartheid regime to silence and disappear people, and the fact that it is still used. And the reason I highlighted my age earlier is because, you know, like, apartheid was supposed to have ended in '94, and it's still, like, these tactics are still being used today. And so I would love to interview both of you for my dissertation if you have capacity, because I do understand that it is a very painful era and painful time of your lives to speak about. And I'm not too sure what to do with the time limitation. Oh, okay, Comrade Meyyassar is ready. Sorry that we lost you earlier. You could please pick up from where we left off.
Events. Now I am in car. I'm so sorry.
Yes.
So I can go on with you. Thank you very much. Because we are now with the prisoner of Club of a Prisoner Palestinian, and another of Ministry of Prisoner, and me as a former prisoner, and with Tunisian Association, Ru'a, and Qirtaj, New Qirtaj Mission, Nizar. We are on the Palestinian Tunisian Week to support the Palestinian prisoners under arrest. And now we are in Jirba. We arrived before just 1 hour, and we will continue our week this in events, activities, to be with the Tunisian people, to speak about the situation of Palestinian prisoner at Israeli prison. So I am sorry that I will speak with you. Maybe I will stay in another نوقف في مكان في ضوء على الأقل أو إضاءة هون. Just this okay now?
Yes, I can hear you clearly. We can hear you.
Okay. As you say that Meyyassar Attiyyati, Palestinian woman, as all the Palestinian women, and all the Palestinian women were under arrest. Most of them under arrest from Israeli occupation. Most of Palestinian women under arrest, not just to be at a prison or at a jail, at the house, at the siege, at the apartheid wall, under arrest because they arrested her husband, her daughter, her son, and all the time women follow up. So the pain is more upon Palestinian women, really, more and more. We are suffering from Israeli occupation, even in our social life, in our daily life. So we are not in a good situation. We are not living as all the people. Because the Israeli occupation, they are inhumanity, they are dealing with us as violence. Before speaking about what happened or the reaction from the arrested upon the families. Really, it is very important what you are saying. Just to, because we are now in Adar in March, and next year it will be April, the day of a prisoner, and this next month, April, will be the day of a prisoner, 17 April, and now we are in March, the Mother's Day. So from you, the message from the female prisoners, we have now at the prison, Israeli prison, 10 mothers.
Yes.
10 mothers, and they are suffering. They can't see their kids. The message from Mu'tasem for his mother, Isra Jabis, whom arrested for 11 years, and she is injured by pumping gas from the Israeli, and all her body is burned. Her son Mu'tasem, when he visited her at the first time, he was afraid. He said that, no, you are not my mother. And yesterday, the day before, he sent for her a letter, a message on the Mother's Day. It is full of pain, full of suffering. He needs his mother. This is the occupation. And what is the situation? You can imagine what happened for the 10 women now whom are mothers waiting. I can't imagine what happened because I was at a prison. They are waiting the sounds through the transistor radio to hear the sound of her daughter, of her son, of her husband, to say, happy day for you. And all the girls, the ladies hang the transistor like this to hear the sound which is coming from the radio. It is hard to say, it is hard to explain this. And because the Athir from the radio, the Israeli at the prison put something not to let us hearing good. So we are, look, you can imagine you upon my soldier, my body like here, and you hang the radio transistor like this to hear the sound of your mother.
Yes.
Imagine this, just imagine this. It is very hard. And we have now at the prison 31 ladies at the prison. One of them, Shuruk al-Badan, is sentenced for administrative detention. And my colleague, my comrade, speaking about the administrative detention. And we have a girl, Nufuz Hamad from Sheikh Jarrah al-Quds, under the age of 15. It is illegal. Yes, it is illegal. It is opposite of the international law. But just a very big question for all the world, Israel occupation, or Israel democratic state, the democratic state, not just, this is my opinion, the democratic state, Israel. When arrested a girl 15 years, it is a democratic state. When Israel democratic, as the world say, took a decision at the parliament to sentence the kids under the age of 14, it is a democratic state. This is Israel. This is Israel, which all the world say Israel.
Meyyassar, I'm so sorry to interject. I'm being very mindful of the time, and I know the next comrade is also joining us remotely, so I'm not sure if it will kick him out. And so I was hoping, firstly, thank you so much for your time and like just enduring the difficulties and being able to join the conversation. I'd just like to tie the conversation, well, I'm hoping that Comrade Kleinschmidt will be able to do this for us, and of course any one of the panelists can also join in, but I'm hoping we can get some, tangible steps as to how we as the audience can join in the resistance, in the efforts to free political prisoners, not just in Palestine, but in the world. Now, Comrade Kleinschmidt was born in Namibia and grew up in Johannesburg. He was involved in setting up the Steve Biko, I think the Zimela Trust Fund, which was that of Comrade Steve Biko, and he will tell us a little bit more about the work that he's doing, but as well as how to, get involved in the movement. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and I want to express, firstly, greetings to you all. Secondly, that I am humbled to be in the company of those who are suffering and those who are experiencing those enormous losses at this moment. So it's a pleasure to talk to you. I briefly want to say that I too was a detainee in the South African prisons in 1975, and I want to express my empathy with Neta, who speaks of the difference in which she was being treated, because I was treated as a white prisoner, and thus a white political prisoner was treated very different to a black political prisoner. There was only one big difference, and that was that I envied the black prisoners, because the black prison was full of prisoners, and so you had the means to communicate with others. In the prison in which I was, the next prisoner was 30 cells away, and I had to sing and shout in order to communicate with him. Anyway, to say that I spent my time in what you in Palestine experience as administrative detention, I spent under what was called then Section 6 of the Terrorism Act, and that meant I was in solitary confinement. I was never charged, and I was ultimately released without having ever appeared in a court of law. The experience of that, and I won't go into that in detail because I want to get back to the question of solidarity. The anger that you feel when you come out of prison was that you feel even more motivated to fight the evil that got you into prison in the first place. And it was in fact Comrade Prema's brother, Indrus, who had just served 10 years and came out of prison. I had just come out of detention after a few months of detention. And he said to me, the struggle goes on. It was Comrade Prema's brother who got me deeper involved in the struggle. And that resulted in my having to flee South Africa. Otherwise, I would have been back in detention and probably been sentenced to a long term of imprisonment in a trial that later on was to be known as the trial of Tokyo Sexwale and 11 others. To come to the point, I had the good fortune in exile in London for 12 years to be head of an organization called the International Defense and Aid Fund for Southern Africa. And I speak to this as a model which I dream would apply to what we as South Africans owe to people that are suffering incarceration and oppression today. What we did in the International Defense and Aid Fund wasn't to be so much on the political barricades. Our sympathy, our empathy, our solidarity with that was unquestioned. But we did something else, and that else is what I think is instructive. We long before I joined the organization. It was in fact after the treason trial of 1956 to 1961 that in London, a certain Canon Collins of St. Paul's Cathedral said that he would identify families in Britain, and later on he found families all over Europe, and later on all over the globe, whom he would hand an address to, an address of a family that was related to someone imprisoned, incarcerated, or persecuted. And he said, would you write them a letter, and will you express your empathy, your solidarity, your support? And he did that. And in that situation, there were ultimately, and I inherited this and expanded it, there were ultimately over 2,000 families all over the world who communicated with a family in South Africa whose spouse was in prison or detained or incarcerated. And they wrote, that single family wrote to this particular family in a particular place in South Africa, often for 10 years, for 15 years, the same family communicating with the same family. And real important friendships developed. And the Defense and Aid Fund collected all the letters that were sent and all the letters that came back for a particular reason. And the reason was that the person who sent the letter from Europe said, I support you in, you are going through a very difficult time, but I also want to be sure that your children are able to go to school. And if that requires money, I will send you a postal order to facilitate that. I also want to be sure that if it is possible for you to visit your spouse imprisoned, you should at least have the money to visit that person once a year, and I will send you that money. Now that expression of solidarity is a model, and I would wish and love for that to be emulated in the case of the people who are suffering, those whom we are talking about today, and that we can find 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 South African families who will have it in them to start off with feeling the empathy, the emotion that says you are suffering, who will from that deduct the need to express real sense of solidarity, solidarity because you have once been a victim of an oppressive situation yourself. And I might say there is an important product that flows from that, and that is the situation where those people who have had that relationship, not only does this develop into friendships, but it develops into a political consciousness that is invaluable in all of this. And I think that within that, the Tambo Dado Palestine Fund has an important and really relevant message to communicate to South Africans at this point. I thank you.
Thank you so much. Comrade Kleinschmidt was detained in 1975, as he said. He fled in 1976 and was the director of the International Defense and Fund for Southern Africa from 1982 to 91 when he returned to South Africa. And he was actually the legal guardian of Mandela's daughters during the Winnie imprisonment in 1974 and has knighthood from the King of Sweden and the Austrian Bruno Kinsley Prize for his contributions to human rights. So thank you so much also for making time to join us and for those very invaluable contributions, because more than just, boycotting, we have all just been through a pandemic. We are still going through a pandemic, but during hard lockdown, just that isolation and not having contact with our loved ones is something that we can all relate to. And I think what you're saying about forming real meaningful human connections through things such as letters and so forth are really, really meaningful. And I am mindful of the time, but we do have some very important people in the audience here today as well. And Comrade Feroza, who has been so instrumental in bringing us all together and organizing this very prestigious event, will introduce some former activists and stalwarts who will be giving a message of support. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Chair. Amandla!
Away to.
Amandla!
Away to.
So I think today was so emotional for me, and I think for everyone it's been really emotional, but we don't have time. But we must embark on a campaign that is a solid campaign, like Comrade Horst has just told us. We need to think of ideas of how we can connect with Palestinian families, Palestinian prisoners, how we can continue and intensify the call for freeing all political prisoners in Palestine. But today we've got some very important people online. We have Firoz Kachalia, we have who else? We have Vali Musa, we have other people in the room. We have a very important person, Comrade Jesset. We're going to give you the mic. We've got Faisal Radera, we've got Naim Jina, we've got quite a few people. So I think I'm going to give everyone maybe just 1 or 2 minutes just for message of support.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to hand over first to Uncle Jesset.
Thank you. Thank you. It's interesting that we are meeting at the same place that I was imprisoned in. I had failed to report on my those days, and I was sentenced to 10 days imprisonment here at the fort. I was taken in with the ordinary prisoners, and I was given a feast of lovely bread and food, and the prison authorities thought that it was unfair for me to be with the ordinary prisoners, as they took me to the solitary confinement, which was a small spaces area where people who were going to be hanged were kept. And I was put into that little space for 10 days. I must say that I lost about 10 kilos. But this is not the only prison I saw. I have also had the fortune to be in the Cape Town prison, Portsmouth, and I also was in Maritzburg prison. The interesting thing is, in those prisons, the warders were not the people who abused us. It's the security police. I remember that as when I was in Maritzburg prison, we were allowed to order reading material, and I remember that there was a book written by Professor Edward Rowe, who's a biologist at the University of Utrecht. It was called whatever it is. And when the book came, the warders were very friendly, and they knew that if I mentioned that book, the securities would get hold of it. So they said, just that there's here a long way to live, and I got the book. But there was a difference between the warders who were sometimes very sympathetic, unlike the security police. On a Sunday, you would get special food because the cooks were ordinary prisoners, but they appreciated our presence. So we were in a certain way fortunate, unlike the prisoners of Palestine who are being tortured, murdered, and helpless. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I think we need a whole day to listen to you. Your story is something that must be told. The prisoners in Palestine are going on a national strike on Friday, the 25th. Let's keep them in mind. And if we can send as many support messages as possible, let's do that. But let me hand over to Comrade Faisal to give a message of support.
So thank you very much. I'm not going to be talking about personal experiences, but to reinforce the message that Horst brought to the meeting this evening about the Tambo Dadu Palestine Legal Fund. We have, of course, Naim Jina, who's with us in that organization. And Roshan Dadu, of course, is the daughter of Dr. Dadu, a person who played such an important role in our early history and until he passed away in London. So this fund has been set up, and it's still very young in its history. We would really like to welcome every family in South Africa to show solidarity with us and solidarity with the people of Palestine. So we will actually launch this officially soon so that everybody will know where to contact and send names of their families who want to actually lead on this particular structure. So, but we haven't got to that point as yet. But it's an important solidarity organization that's been set up.
Thank you so much for that. I think the South African BDS Coalition, and I'm just talking on behalf of the coalition, would definitely want to work with such a structure. So let me hand over to Naim Jina and perhaps Roshan as well for a few words before we go to some food and refreshments.
Thank you. I didn't have the honor of being a political prisoner, so I won't talk about that. But at the risk of sounding conspiratorial, just to say that we didn't plan this, but I want to pick up where Faisal left off. Sir Horst, now that I know that he's a knight, Faisal, Roshan and I are involved with the Tambo Dadu Palestine Fund. So as Faisal said, if there are families here who want to be part of this project, we're starting to collect names now on both sides. On the Palestinian side, contacts in different families of political prisoners, and on the South African side, families that want to be part of this kind of project. To each family will get the name of one family of a political prisoner with whom they will maintain relationships. At this stage, we don't think that we will necessarily be sending money, etc., but just as an act of solidarity. So we're starting to collect those names of families. Anyone that wants to volunteer as a family to take this up, please contact any of the three of us here with your contact details. We will then follow it up with you with a questionnaire, etc., and take it forward from there.
Roshan, do you want to have?
Thanks. Well, I'll just say that I think it was a great honor that it was named, the fund was asked to be named the Tambo Dadu Palestine Legal Fund, because I think it's an appropriate expression of solidarity and use of the name Dadu. The International Defense and Aid Fund was a remarkable organization that Prema's sisters also worked for, and my mum worked for in London for quite a long time. And I think it would be great if we can get this going here in terms of support for Palestinian prisoners' families.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So we've left the best for last. Uncle Kista, you've got the last word for all of us.
I can't really share anything about being in prison because I was never in prison. I played a very low profile in my activities in MK and the South African Communist Party, and managed to evade the police by going underground. And I was fortunate that I was never imprisoned. But I can't hear very well. I just heard somebody speaking about Dr. Naidoo. I have the great honor and privilege, 2 weeks before he went into exile, myself and the late comrade Reggie Van Der in Cathy's Fact cooked for Dr. Naidoo, a great soul, a great hero of this country. And after he had lunch with, I think it was Akhi Patel that time, and Isupahat's father, Dr. Naidoo said to us, hey, comrades, this food is for the gods. He enjoyed it so much. And as I said, I'm very, very fortunate that I was amongst people and new people, great souls like Dr. Naidoo. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So just in closing, this is the Israeli Apartheid Week. So for the next, till the 4th of April, almost every day there are really interesting, intense events happening. So just look out for these events on your social media. If not, you can contact me or anyone else from the PSA or the South African BDS Coalition. Yeah, my boss. So tomorrow we are picketing in front of the Sandton Convention. The South African government has got an investment conference. And as you know, that we have welcomed a company like CBC, Molco, and similar companies like G4S, etc., in our country. They operate in the occupied territories. They are Zionist, Israeli-based organizations that have come into our country not so much to invest, but to use us as markets, to take our resources, to destroy jobs, to pay slave labor, and as you know, with Clover, workers are being retrenched, etc. So many, both between with SAFTU as well as COSATU and the South African BDS Coalition, we are having a picket tomorrow in Sandton. So please join us if you can. That will be great. At 10 o'clock. Then and then, like I say, there's events every day. On Friday, there's poetry. On Saturday, there's the Don Matera show or poetry. On Sunday, there's Sophia Town, a walk in Sophia Town, as well as a picnic movie in Amarentia. So the whole week, there's quite a few events. There's events around labor, etc., linking up with people in Palestine at all times. So please attend these events. And with regards to the prisoner campaign, we are going to have, make this a sustainable, structured campaign from today onwards. So we hope to bring each one of you into this campaign so that you can not only give it direction, but support it as well. Thank you. There's refreshments being served there. Please help yourself. Don't go home hungry.
Comrade Feroza, thank you so much for those closing remarks. Thank you to absolutely everybody who has availed themselves to join us today. Thank you to the Palestine Solidarity Alliance that has made this event possible for us. My generation is known as the hashtag generation, and so I'm sure we'll continue this conversation online. Thank you so much to everybody. Please have a lovely evening.